The studio went silent in a way it never had before. Johnny Cash sat across from Johnny Carson, his hands trembling slightly against the armrest, and for a moment, a long, unbearable moment, he couldn't speak. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The audience, used to laughter and applause, didn't know what to do with this kind of quiet. Carson leaned forward, just an inch, and did something he almost never did on camera. He waited, not with the polished patience of a talk show host filling dead air, with the stillness of someone who understood that some truths take time to surface. Cash's eyes were wet, his jaw tightened, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked on the very first word. "John," he said, "I don't know how to explain what I became." It was 1985. Johnny Cash was 53 years old, and by all accounts, he'd already lived 3 lifetimes. The world knew him as the Man in Black, the outlaw poet, the voice of prisoners and forgotten souls, the husband of June Carter Cash. But what they didn't know, what he'd never fully admitted on national television, was how close he'd come to losing everything. Carson didn't interrupt, he just nodded, his expression open and unguarded in a way that felt almost private. This wasn't the Tonight Show anymore. This was 2 men sitting in the truth. Cash took a breath. His hand stopped trembling, but only because he gripped the armrest tighter. "The pills," he said quietly. "They didn't start as a problem. They started as a solution." The audience was completely still now. You could hear the hum of the studio lights. He explained it slowly, carefully, like a man defusing a bomb made of his own past. The amphetamines to stay awake on tour, the barbiturates to come down afterward. The endless cycle of highs and crashes that turned months into a blur and years into a black hole he couldn't climb out of. "I'd take 100 pills a day sometimes," Cash said, and his voice didn't rise with drama. It fell, heavy with shame. "I didn't know who I was anymore. I'd look in the mirror and see someone I didn't recognize." Carson's face didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A flicker of recognition, of understanding. He'd interviewed hundreds of people, celebrities, politicians, legends, but this wasn't an interview anymore. This was a confession. And then Cash said the part that made the room hold its breath. "June found me in a cave." He paused, and the weight of those 6 words settled over everything. Carson tilted his head slightly, inviting him to continue without saying a word. "I'd been gone for days," Cash went on. "I was in Nickajack Cave, down in Tennessee. I went in there to die. John, that's the truth. I crawled as far back as I could go into the dark, and I just laid down. I wanted it to be over." The camera stayed on his face. The producers didn't cut away. This was the kind of television that didn't happen anymore. Raw, unfiltered, human. "But June came looking for me," Cash said, and now his voice broke completely. "She went into that cave. She pulled me out, and I fought her." Carson's hand moved slightly on the desk, as if he wanted to reach out but stopped himself. "I didn't want to be saved," Cash whispered. "I fought her. I screamed at her. I told her to leave me there, and she wouldn't. She just wouldn't." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of pain, full of gratitude, full of the kind of love that doesn't make sense unless you've been that broken. And then Johnny Carson did something he almost never did. He broke his own rule. He stood up slowly and walked around the desk. The audience gasped softly, confused, moved, unsure what was happening. Carson's producers in the booth froze. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't planned. Carson sat down on the edge of the couch, right next to Johnny Cash, and he put his hand on Cash's shoulder. Not for the camera, not for the show, just because it was the right thing to do. "You're here now," Carson said quietly, his voice barely picked up by the microphone. "That's what matters." Cash nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked at Carson, really looked at him, and something passed between them that didn't need words. 2 men who'd spent their lives performing, pretending, holding it together in front of millions, finally letting the mask slip. The audience didn't applaud. They didn't need to. Some of them were crying. Carson stayed there for a moment longer, then gave Cash's shoulder a gentle squeeze before standing and walking back to his desk. He didn't make a joke to lighten the mood. He didn't pivot to a commercial break. He just sat down and let the moment exist. "June saved your life," Carson said softly. "More than once," Cash replied, his voice steadier now. "More than once." What happened next wasn't what anyone expected. Carson didn't move on to the next question. He didn't steer the conversation toward Cash's music or his latest album. Instead, he asked something that felt almost too personal for television. When you came out of that cave, when June pulled you back into the light, did you know right away that you wanted to live? Cash thought about it. Really thought about it. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't painful. It was honest. No, he said finally. I didn't. For a long time after that, I still wasn't sure. The drugs didn't stop right away. The darkness didn't just disappear. But June, she didn't give up. And eventually, I stopped wanting her to. He smiled then, just barely, and it was the saddest, most beautiful smile. She taught me that sometimes you don't save yourself all at once. You do it one day at a time, one choice at a time, and some days you let someone else carry you until you can walk again. Carson nodded slowly. His eyes were glassy now too, though he'd never admit it. That's a hell of a gift, Carson said. It's the only one that matters, Cash replied. The interview continued for a few more minutes, but nothing else came close to that moment. They talked about music, about faith, about Cash's upcoming tour. But the weight of what had been said hung in the air, invisible but undeniable. When the segment ended and they cut to commercial, Carson stood and shook Cash's hand. The audience gave him a standing ovation, not the polite, rehearsed kind, but the kind that comes from somewhere deep and real. Backstage, after the cameras stopped rolling, Carson and Cash stood together in the hallway. No assistants, no producers, just the two of them. Thank you for that, Carson said quietly. Cash looked at him, surprised. For what? For being honest, for letting people see it. Carson paused, then added, Not enough people do that anymore. Cash nodded. I figured if I don't tell the truth now, when will I? They stood there for another moment, two legends in an empty hallway before going their separate ways. That appearance became one of the most replayed moments in Tonight Show history. Not because it was entertaining, not because it was funny or shocking or scandalous, but because it was real. Johnny Cash had stood on the edge of oblivion, stared into the darkness, and somehow, through love, through stubbornness, through grace, found his way back. And Johnny Carson, the man who'd made a career out of keeping things light, had honored that truth by letting it breathe. Years later, after both men were gone, that interview would resurface again and again. People would watch it and see themselves, their own struggles, their own caves, their own desperate need to be pulled back into the light. Because that's what great television does. It doesn't just entertain. It reminds us that we're not alone, that even legends break, that even outlaws need saving, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit in the silence and admit you didn't make it on your own. Johnny Cash lived another 18 years after that night. He kept making music. He kept fighting his demons. And he kept loving June Carter until the day she died, just 4 months before he followed her. But that moment on The Tonight Show, that moment when he told the truth, when Carson stood up and walked around the desk, when two men let the world see their humanity, that moment never died at all. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own battles or the people who refused to let you go, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes we all need to be reminded that it's okay to break as long as we let someone help us put the pieces back together.